Do you remember the moment when you faced your first video game boss? The gateway to your progress, the first hurdle of many? A first boss has to straddle a fine line between seeming like a challenge and being relatively simple to overcome. Swing too far in one direction or the other, and you're left with something that either discourages new players or leaves them feeling underwhelmed. That then begs the question, what makes a good first boss? How's it going everyone, and welcome back to the loading zone, where today we're going to be talking about some of the best first bosses in video games. Now for me, when I think about these guys, what traditionally comes to mind is an opponent who is imposing, who is big, who might look kind of scary on the surface, but is actually relatively simple. I think the poster boy of this concept would be King Bob-omb from Super Mario 64, who happens to be the first boss of the first mission of the first level of the game. You meet this guy at the top of the mountain, and he's a lot larger than the rest of the Bob-ombs you've seen, so he does appear to be pretty intimidating. His main form of attack is to pick you up and throw you off the mountain, which can undo a decent amount of your progress, so when you first encounter him, it does seem like he's a very tough guy, but in reality, it's pretty simple to defeat him. All you have to do is run around, grab him from behind, and throw him, I think, 3 times, and he's gone. It was a good way to ease players into the game and help them to get used to controlling characters in a 3D space, and you have to pull off a similar maneuver in the first Bowser fight where you run around behind him just like with King Bob-omb, pick him up, and it's a bit more complex since you have to rotate the stick and then throw him into the bombs, but it's largely the same concept, so I think it does a good job of teeing you up for that fight. Now, a similarly, I would actually say creepy looking boss is Empress Bulblax from Pikmin 2, who you find in the Hole of Beasts, which is one of the caves in that game. You do encounter her multiple times, but on the first time, you're in this room and you have a little section of the cave where you can stand and face her directly. Now, what she is a massive, like, cylinder-shaped bulborb. She's very long. What she does is rolls around on the ground, which can steamroll your Pikmin essentially, and this attack does have the potential to destroy an entire army of Pikmin if you're not careful, so you need to find a way to play around it. The way to do this is to use that safe zone and attack her while she's standing still, because in between attacks she's relatively stationary, and that is your window to counterattack. When she starts shaking off, you need to whistle your Pikmin back quickly or else they'll get crushed, so you need to get into the swing, get into the rhythm of the fight, but once you've done that, you can probably get through it with minimal casualties. The Parasite Queen from Metroid Prime is another interesting one, although it's less about the actual fight itself and more about the build-up, because as you're going through the frigate, you find a lot of these space pirates who have been injured in different ways, so some of them have acid burn, some of them have internal damage, some of them are half-eaten, and as you see all these dying crewmates, you wonder, what could have possibly done this? So as you get deeper and deeper into the ship, you get closer and closer to the source of all this damage, and eventually you run into this big, terrifying, mutated monster. And unfortunately the actual fight itself is a little anticlimactic, because I think you can beat the queen in about 5 charge shots or something. It's not a hard fight, but it's just that tension as you approach it that makes it stick in your mind so much. Not all first bosses have to look this strong though, because there's one that I think functions really well and it serves its purpose fantastically without looking like an immediate threat. It flips the concept of a first boss on its head, and this is the Choo Choo from Minish Cap. Now, as you guys know, Choo Choos are just ordinary enemies in the Zelda games. You can beat them very quickly, just a couple of sword swings, and generally they're pretty harmless. But in the Minish Cap, the main gimmick of the game is that you can shrink down to the size of an ant, and you have to complete the first dungeon, which is the Deepwood Shrine, in its entirety as Small Link, and this, of course, includes the boss fight. The intro sequence shows just a normal Choo Choo, as I've said, falling into the ceiling of the dungeon, and when it appears in the room you're in, because you're so small, it looks giant, and I think that was a really clever way to use Minish Cap's main mechanic. This essentially creates a fight that's different to the normal Choo Choos you just kill in Hyrule Field. If you try and just hack away at it with your sword, you won't get anywhere, so you need to find a way around it. You need to think outside the box a little bit. And the way you end up defeating it is by using the dungeon's item, which is the Gust Jar, and you have to suck away at the base of the Choo Choo, which causes it to lose its balance and topple over, which then gives you an opportunity to use your sword. You see this a few more times over the course of Minish Cap, like there's a big Octorok as well in the Ice Dungeon, but I think the Choo Choo was a great way to set that trend into motion. The thing with all 4 bosses I've listed so far though, is that to beat them, there's a trick or a gimmick that you have to figure out, but once you do that, once you know what it is, the fight becomes easy, and this is a very commonly used trope for first bosses, but it's not one that they all have to follow. If we look at it from a different direction, they can instead be a challenge with no secrets, no smoke and mirrors, just a pure test of skill as sort of a first hurdle to make sure you're ready for the rest of the game. One that comes to mind is the Great Izuchi from Monster Hunter Rise, because I've been playing that game a lot recently. I'd imagine it's very similar across all Monster Hunter games, but this guy is the first real monster that you have to face, because you do a few smaller missions beforehand, but I think this guy is the first urgent quest, is what they're called. Now, bosses in Monster Hunter work quite a bit differently to other games, because in most cases outside of this series, the fights are usually over in a couple of minutes, but in Monster Hunter, because the whole game revolves around killing these monsters and taking out these bosses, boss after boss after boss, each one takes a mammoth effort to take down, and the Great Izuchi, when you're starting out, is no different. You see a cutscene right before you have to take it on, where it bullies a bunch of the smaller monsters that you had to hunt in the prior missions, and this sets it up as a formidable opponent. Of course, as a veteran, when you go back to this fight, you'll find that this guy is a bit of a pushover, but when you're starting out and you only have all the basic gear, you don't really know what you're doing as far as controls go or how your weapon works, this guy will give you a run for your money. I remember when I first started playing this game, hunts would often take about half an hour if I was doing them solo, because the damage you can do with the weapons that you have is very, very limited. And the other thing is, you don't know how much damage you're doing, because the monsters in Monster Hunter never have health bars, so all you have to go on is the monster's behavior, essentially. With Great Izuchi, its main weapon is very obvious when you look at it. It's a massive scythe-like tail. Many of its attacks revolve around this. He does a lot of tail slams, and his biggest attack is a massive spin where he winds up and just goes full Beyblade on you. They'll do a lot of damage to you, but when you get further and further into the fight, you'll eventually learn how to telegraph the attacks. You'll be able to predict them because you see those same animations for when Izuchi is getting ready to attack, and you'll be able to anticipate the attack, you'll be able to dodge and then counter. I think part of the beauty of this fight is that because it's such a simple monster, it means that you can beat this with any weapon of your choice, because, let me tell you, there are a lot of weapons in Monster Hunter, but if you're using a bladed weapon like the dual blades or the longsword, there's the tail right there that you can slice off. If you're using a ranged weapon like the bow or the bowguns, he stays relatively stationary between his attacks, which gives you a good window of opportunity to lock your aim onto him and shoot him. So while on your first few attempts you may well struggle, as you get better and better at the game, Great Izuchi becomes less and less of an obstacle, and it means that by the time you beat him once and for all, you know you're ready for the next monster, and so the cycle continues, the deadly, addictive gameplay loop of Monster Hunter. If we're staying on a similar line of thought, another boss that fulfills a very similar role to the Great Izuchi is Tricky the Triceratops from Diddy Kong Racing, not to be confused with the Triceratops of the same name from Star Fox Adventures. Despite both being Rareware characters, they are two very different entities. So this guy is the first boss of the Dino Domain area. You have to challenge him after winning all 4 courses from that world, and the race takes place on this big spiraling mountain. And just like with Izuchi, there's no secret hack that will instantly win you this battle, you just kind of have to be good at the game. I remember I struggled a lot with it because for one, there are no guardrails, which means that you can fall off the mountain and can lose the race just like that. There's trees and bushes that you can bump into which completely kill your momentum, and if you touch Tricky, then you also spin out. So you have to be careful on this one. You have to not only be fast, stay ahead of him, but also keep control of your carts. There are some things that you can do to help your cause, so you can pick up the items like the missiles to shoot Tricky, and you can also pick up the boosters, which can help you to pick up speed and take the one shortcut at the end, which is a little tunnel via a hole in the side of the mountain, and this is definitely worth taking because it cuts out a large portion of the course, but again, it takes skill to pull it off. I think there's some bushes by the entrance, which you gotta be careful to dodge, and then you need the booster to get through, or else it's absolutely not worth it at all, because otherwise you'll be slowed down by the fact that it's uphill. If you maintain your lead and front run all the way through, then you'll be able to pull off the win. And even if you are lagging slightly behind, what's good is that the game rewards you for your dedication, for the endurance, for making it to the top, because right towards the end of the race, Tricky slows down just a bit, which gives you an opportunity to catch up, to maybe overtake him at the last second, and that just makes the win all the more satisfying. It's gonna take you a lot of tries, there's no doubt about that, but by the end of it, you'll be a much better driver. So while some first bosses are quite tricky, no pun intended, others can go in the complete opposite direction. They can just be jokes, and I think one man exemplifies this perfectly and is a brilliant example of how to do a joke character right. And that is my guy, Glass Joe from Punch-Out. Everything about him is just so pathetic, and it's honestly hilarious. Like, even his name, Glass Joe, is a pun on the fact that he has a glass jaw. He has a win-to-loss record of 1-99, and in his intro, we don't see him training or boxing at all, we just see him holding a baguette and standing next to the Eiffel Tower. And he can't even walk into the ring without stumbling over. He fumbles his own intro. As for the actual fight, at this point the game hasn't really started punishing you for just throwing attacks whenever you feel like it. So you can just jab, you can throw out hooks, and Glass Joe doesn't really try to defend himself. In the later stages, you'll figure out that Punch-Out is more of a puzzle game than a fighting game, but here, you can just have fun and destroy this guy. I think when you knock him down for the first time, and he gets back up, he'll start to block some of your attacks, but even so, his guard is very, very weak. All of his attacks are super slow, so you can just dodge them, and even if you do get hit by them, you'll barely take any damage. At one point in the fight, he'll even try and taunt you by saying, vive la France, and then steps towards you. But I think if you correctly time a 3-star punch when he does this, you can just get an instant knockout. Not even a knockdown, he just dies then and there. And his animation for when that happens is beautiful, man. There's just a bunch of croissants bursting out of him as he falls to the ground in slow motion. Just beating the living daylights out of this guy feels so rewarding. He's more of a punching bag than an actual opponent, and I think that makes him a very, very fun way to start off the game. Another first boss that doesn't get taken very seriously is Andrew Oikony from Star Fox Assault. Now, to provide a bit of background, Andrew was in Star Fox 64 as a member of Star Wolf, but he was widely considered to be the weakest member of the team and got on everyone else's nerves, and for that reason, he got kicked out and is now flying solo. So in Star Fox Assault, he commands his own fleet of ships, which does pose a bit of a threat, but it's not anything that the Cornerian army can't handle. Andrew himself is Andross's nephew, so it makes sense that when you actually have to fight him one-on-one, he takes a lot of inspiration from his uncle. His ship is like a big robot head with 2 hands that you shoot, which is pretty much an exact replica of the Andross fight from Star Fox 64. I think Falco may even call him out for copying Andross. I'd have to double check that, but I think there is some dialogue that pokes fun at him for doing that. It's not a particularly difficult battle either, you get him down pretty quickly, but what happens afterwards is actually very interesting because it transitions from a joke boss into something a lot more serious, a lot more sinister. Andrew, after being weakened by you, then gets shot down by a laser from the distance, and from who knows where flies in this weird butterfly-looking mechanical creature, and out of nowhere you're just thrown into an entirely different situation where you have to take on a foe you've never seen before in your life and you don't know what it's capable of. What sells this one for me is just the shock factor and the mystery of what exactly this thing is. It's fear of the unknown. Eventually, you do manage to kill it, and after that, Fox has to swoop in and grab its core to do some analysis, and it's revealed that what you just fought was an aporoid, which is a parasitic organism that can control the mind of its host. These guys are the main villains of the game. To me, just having a Star Fox villain that isn't Andross again, and seeing that same story play out over and over, like the one in Star Fox 64, Star Fox Adventures having Andross as the villain, even Star Fox Zero, and I think for that reason, this boss fight and Star Fox Assault in general is a real breath of fresh air for the franchise. What's especially neat is that the aporoids aren't just a one and done thing for this specific first boss fight, but they're actually a running enemy that has a big impact on the story. And I've always found that first bosses that have some story relevance, that have some influence over the plot, leave a stronger impression on me than ones that don't. So another example of this would be Ghirahim from Skyward Sword, who of course is the main villain of that game. You fight him at the end of the first dungeon, which is the Skyview Temple, and right from the first cutscene, the first time you meet this guy, you get a very strong sense of his vibe and how strange he is, how creepy he is. Like his body language, his mannerisms, the way he breathes down Link's neck. All of it is so unsettling and it freaks you out. He's not like this big hulking guy that Ganondorf is, but he still finds a way to be intimidating. Just from his monologue, you already start to feel that this dude is powerful. And I think before the actual battle, he says that he promises that he won't murder you. So you already know that he's just toying with you in this fight. He's not using his full strength. And that's immediately apparent in the fighting style that he takes against you, because he plays this battle very defensively. He just calmly walks towards you slowly and menacingly, and instead of rushing at you with a full-on assault, he lets you make the first move. Now, in Skyward Sword, the combat relies a lot on the motion controls and the direction that you swing your sword, so you can't get through this game just by attacking any old way, and if you have developed some bad habits by this point of just hacking and slashing and hoping for the best, this fight will drill them out of you, because if you telegraph your attacks and just swing your sword, Girohim will grab it out of your hands and taunt you for being so predictable. He'll throw your sword away and you have to run and pick it back up. And if you want to have a chance of actually landing a hit against him, you need to be more careful, you need to be smarter. You sort of bait him into believing that you're going to attack in one direction and then swing in another. Through doing this, you'll land a few clean hits on him, but you never feel like you're on top. It always seems like Girohim is just messing around with you. Also, if you learnt from previous Zelda games that you have to use the dungeon item to beat the boss, that won't work here, because if you try and use the beetle against him, you won't have any luck whatsoever. I think he just like swats out of the air and slaps you in the face, and in a way, that sort of doubles as a metaphorical wake-up slap to make you think to yourself, man, what am I doing using a flying insect that's used to pick up items against this guy? In the second phase of the fight, he does get more aggressive with a few knives that he throws at you, and he'll start to do a big charging attack, which you need to parry with your shield, so again, it makes sure you're up to par with that, and at the end of it all, he just admits that perhaps he underestimated you a little bit, but he's still virtually unscathed, and then just teleports away, leaving you to wonder what just happened, who you just fought, because this is your first time meeting this guy, and what an introduction he has. Now, the final example I want to talk about in this podcast is a big part of the reason as to why I wanted to make this episode in the first place, and she is similar to Girohim in the sense that she has a big impact on the story, but the manner in which you encounter and defeat her is very different, and that's largely down to the nature of the game that she is from. Recently, I've been playing a lot of the original Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney trilogy, and in the first two games, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney and Justice for All, you see the crime being committed, and then you, a defense attorney, have to serve as a lawyer for a defendant who did not commit the crime. The common denominator with both of these cases is that you actually see the killer's face and watch as they murder the victim. So in the first game you have Frank Sorwitz, and in the second game you have Richard Wellington. In the first game, I think this was perfectly acceptable because it was the introduction to the whole franchise. In the second one, one, I'd say it just felt like having a tutorial for the sake of having a tutorial. It largely follows the same formula as the first one, where you know your defendant is innocent, and then halfway through the case, a not suspicious at all witness who you may or may not have just seen committing the crime takes the stand, and you have to expose the contradictions in their testimony. To tell the truth, it was a little bit disappointing, so going into the third game, Trials and Tribulations, I wasn't sure what to expect from the first case, and what I saw at the beginning caught me very off guard. Like with the first two games, you do see an intro sequence at the beginning which shows the murder, but the surprising thing is that standing over the corpse of the victim is none other than one Phoenix Wright, aka the protagonist of the whole game. As it turns out, this case takes place 5 years prior to the first game, so it's almost like a backstory, and you play as Mia Fey, who ends up being your mentor in the first game. Right off the bat, this is already a lot more interesting, but you know that Phoenix can't have committed the crime, so when the trial starts and court is in session, Phoenix has to give his testimony, and it's here that you find out about his girlfriend at the time, Dahlia Hawthorne, who just so happened to quote-unquote witness the crime taking place. Now, this should already be getting the gears turning in your head, because Dahlia is the only other person aside from Phoenix and the victim Doug Swallow in this case, so this likely means that she must have been the killer. When she first steps into the courtroom, everyone is enamored with her because she seems very sweet on the surface with an elegant aura around her, butterflies flying next to her and a smile on her face, and she pretty much melts the judge and the prosecutor Winston Payne, but we quickly learn that is all just a front. In reality, Dahlia Hawthorne is a big manipulator and was using Phoenix as a means of concealing evidence from a previous case that took place before in which she was a suspect but got off scot-free. Mia was also the defense attorney for this case because she says that she and Dahlia have met before in this courtroom, and one other detail that we find out is that there was a lawyer at the time investigating this case who also happened to be Mia Fey's boyfriend, Diego Armando, who died of poisoning after meeting with Dahlia. When all is said and done, you do secure a guilty verdict, but after that, Dahlia says that this isn't the last that you've seen of her. But what I really like about this statement, and this case as a whole, is that it leaves so many unanswered questions and opens up so many different plot threads. You want to find out what the previous case Dahlia was involved in was, and you want to know how she got away with it. Then there's also Diego Armando, who she poisoned, and that's a whole nother case in itself. And then when she says that you'll meet again, you're left to wonder how that's even possible, because surely she'll get locked up and put in prison for her crimes at the very least. So suffice it to say, this first chapter of the game is a lot more complex than those of the first two in the trilogy, and that's why I like it so much. I'll admit, calling Dahlia Hawthorne a boss per se is a little bit of a stretch, but I do think she still falls under the umbrella. In every sense of the word. I didn't actually intend to make a pun there, but it happens from time to time. I'm just a natural, man. Regardless, I think that's about all we've got time for today, so as always, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Loading Zone podcast. Be sure to let me know some of your favourite first bosses down in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in the next one.